If someone told you that the people who raised you were never your family, that you had been stolen, that someone out there had spent 22 years looking for you and never stopped, would you believe them? I didn't. Not at first. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually began. In a basement in Westport, Connecticut, at 5 o'clock in the morning, the only home I had ever known. My name is Ellie. I'm 22 years old, and for every single one of those 22 years, I was never allowed to sit at the dinner table with my own family. From the outside, the Harmon house looked like a dream. A 2-story colonial on a quiet street in Westport, Connecticut. Manicured lawn, European cars in the driveway, neighbors who were surgeons and hedge fund managers and partners at law firms. The kind of neighborhood where everything looked perfect, because everyone worked very hard to make sure it did. But I knew what that house looked like from the inside. I knew every crack in the basement ceiling. I knew the way the furnace hummed 3 feet from my head on winter nights, the only warmth I had. I knew the smell of the thin mattress I slept on, damp concrete and mildew, because that basement was my bedroom for 22 years. I was up every morning before 5. By 5:15, I was already in the kitchen, scrubbing the countertops, preheating the stove, pulling breakfast together, before the Harmons came downstairs. Douglas Harmon, the man I was told to call Mr. Harmon, never dad, never father, that was one of his rules, would come down around 7, settle into his leather chair, and speak to me in the clipped, flat tone you'd use with someone invisible. His son Cole slept until noon in a corner bedroom with a 70-inch TV on the wall, a PlayStation, and a walk-in closet larger than the entire basement I called home. Cole attended a private academy at $48,000 a year. I was told I was being homeschooled. The truth was simpler and crueler than that. No one taught me anything. I learned to read from old magazines Carol threw away. I learned arithmetic by counting change at the grocery store. Douglas kept an index card taped to the inside of my basement door. 4 rules, written in black ink. You do not sit at the family table. You do not call us mom or dad. You do not leave without permission. You do not speak to strangers. I broke one of those rules once. When I was 16, I walked 3 miles to the nearest bus station with $17 I had saved coin by coin from grocery runs. The police brought me back within 2 hours. Douglas smiled at the officers at the door, warm and grateful, the picture of a concerned father. She has mental health issues, he told them. Thank you so much for bringing her home. They left. He locked the door. I spent 4 days in that basement without food. There was one other moment. I was 17, watering the flowers out front, my sleeves pushed up in the summer heat. Our neighbor, Mrs. Helen Marsh, stopped on the sidewalk. Her eyes dropped to the bruises on my forearms, and she asked quietly, almost carefully, "Are you okay, honey?" Before I could form a single word, Douglas appeared behind me, hand on my shoulder, voice warm as sunlight. "She's always bumping into things, aren't you, Ellie?" I nodded. Mrs. Marsh nodded back. And just like that, the only door that had opened in years swung shut again in under 10 seconds. I believed I deserved all of it. I believed it for 22 years, right up until the morning of Cole's wedding, the day I thought would be the worst day of my life. I had no idea that a man I had never met was already holding a secret that was about to change everything. I believed that for 22 years, right up until the morning everything changed. But before that morning came, there was the night before, and the rehearsal dinner, and the moment a stranger looked at my face like he recognized something I had never been allowed to know about myself. Cole's wedding was the kind of event that made the society pages. 220 guests at the Mayflower in Washington, D.C., a live orchestra, a 5-tier cake flown in from a bakery in Georgetown, and a final bill of $220,000, paid in full by Edward Caldwell, CEO of Caldwell Developments, the man whose daughter Sophia was marrying into the Harmon family. Douglas had been floating on air for weeks. "This is our moment," he kept telling Carol over dinner, the dinner I cooked and served and cleaned up after, while they planned a future I was never part of. "The Caldwells are old money. This marriage changes everything for us." He had no idea how right he was. The night before the wedding, Carol sat me down at the kitchen table and told me what my role would be the following day. "You'll be helping with service, she said, smoothing her robe like the conversation was already over. Pouring champagne, clearing plates, making sure guests have what they need. I had spent 6 months secretly imagining standing at that altar in a bridesmaid's dress, holding flowers. I searched every envelope when the invitations came back from the printer. My name was not on a single one. At the rehearsal dinner at Capitol Grill, Sophia noticed me carrying a tray near the bar and stopped mid-conversation. Wait, are you Cole's sister? Why aren't you sitting with the family? Before I could open my mouth, Carol materialized at my elbow with a warm laugh. Ellie prefers to help out. She's always been shy around crowds. She squeezed my arm like we were close. I looked at the floor and said nothing. Later that same evening, one of Sophia's cousins bumped into me and spilled red wine down the front of my dress, the only black dress I owned. He kept walking without a word. Cole glanced over, saw what happened, and turned back to his friends. I walked to the restroom, locked the stall door, pressed my back against the cold tile wall, and bit down on my lip until the urge to cry passed. That night I sat alone in the basement, holding the only photograph I had of myself with the Harmon family. It was taken at Christmas. Douglas and Carol and Cole stood together under the tree, arms around each other, faces lit up and warm. I was at the edge of the frame, hands folded in front of me, not touching anyone, not being touched. I stared at my reflection in the small cracked mirror above the utility sink, dark chestnut hair, green eyes, a face that looked nothing like the 3 people sleeping upstairs, and for the first time in my life I said it out loud into the silence. Why don't I look like anyone in this house? Then my hand brushed something under the mattress. A folded newspaper, old and yellowed, something Carol must have left behind without realizing. I almost set it aside. Then a small headline in the bottom corner stopped me cold. Baby girl abducted from Johns Hopkins Hospital, 2003, still missing. My hands went still. My heart knocked hard against my ribs. I read it twice. Then I folded it back up, pushed it under the mattress, and told myself it meant nothing. Nobody was looking for me. Nobody had ever looked for me. The next morning I put on my black uniform, tied the white apron around my waist, and entered my brother's wedding through the service entrance. But Edward Caldwell was already there, and he was carrying an old photograph in his jacket pocket, one he had handled so many times the edges had gone soft. There are truths you spend your whole life afraid to know, not because they hurt, but because once you know them, you can never go back to pretending everything is normal. That morning, standing in the grand ballroom of the Mayflower, in my black uniform and white apron, tray balanced in both hands, I was about to come face to face with one of those truths. I just didn't know it yet. The ceremony was everything I had spent years quietly imagining, and nothing I was ever allowed to be part of. Sophia walked down the aisle in a gown with a train that stretched nearly 13 feet behind her. I had been on my knees steaming that fabric since 6 in the morning, moving inch by inch along the hem, terrified of leaving a single crease. The string quartet played something soft and sweeping that filled the room from floor to ceiling. The officiant spoke about love and commitment and the sacred bond of 2 lives becoming one. Douglas and Carol sat in the front row with monogrammed handkerchiefs pressed to the corners of their eyes, performing grief the way they performed everything, for an audience. I stood at the back of the ballroom with a champagne tray in both hands and watched my family from 50 feet away, the way you watch something through glass. At one point, Cole's college friends glanced over at me, curious, and one of them leaned in and asked him something. Cole waved a hand in my direction without turning his head. "That's our housekeeper," he said easily, like the words cost him nothing. "She's been with us forever. Not his sister, not his family, the housekeeper." I kept my face still, and my eyes forward, and told myself it didn't matter. I had been telling myself that for 22 years. After the ceremony, the photographer clapped his hands and called everyone toward the floral arch for formal portraits. "Both families, please," he announced, gesturing broadly. "Come on in, let's get everyone together." The Caldwells assembled on the left, elegant and unhurried. The Harmons gathered on the right, Douglas straightening his tie, Carol smoothing the front of her dress, Cole sliding his arm around Sophia's waist. I took a step backward and tightened my grip on the tray, making myself small. making myself part of the wallpaper the way I always had. Then the photographer swept his gaze across the room, and it landed on me, standing alone near the edge of the crowd, and he pointed. "Hey, are you family?" The question landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. For one long second, nobody moved. Douglas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She's part of the catering staff," he said, his voice flat and final, the tone he used when a matter was closed. And then Edward Caldwell stepped forward. He moved quietly, deliberately, crossing the open space between the two families until he was standing directly beside me. He placed one hand on my shoulder, warm, steady, certain. And when he spoke, his voice carried across the entire room without effort. "She stands with me." Douglas went the color of old paper. He could not object. Not here, not in front of 220 people, not to the man whose name was on every check that had paid for this day. But I felt his fury from across the room, the way you feel heat radiating off pavement in August. Invisible, relentless, impossible to ignore. When the photographer finished and turned the camera screen toward Edward to show him the preview, Edward took the camera carefully in both hands and zoomed in slowly until my face filled the frame. He handed the camera back without another word, turned toward the corridor, and was already pressing his phone to his ear before he cleared the doorway. "Pull the FBI file," I heard him say, his voice dropping low and urgent. "The Johns Hopkins abduction, 2003, and have a DNA collection kit ready tonight." Douglas's hand closed around my arm the instant Edward disappeared from view. He pulled me through the service corridor behind the kitchen without a word. The fluorescent lights above us buzzed a sick yellow, the air thick and close with fryer grease and industrial dish soap, the noise of the reception fading to a distant hum behind us. When he finally stopped and turned on me, his voice was something I had never heard from him before. Not the bellow he used when I burned the eggs, not the cold command he used when he wanted something done. This was quieter than either of those, controlled in a way that felt more dangerous than rage. "What did you say to him?" "Nothing," I told him. "I swear to you, I didn't say anything." He took one step closer and pressed a single finger into my chest, hard enough that I felt it against my sternum. "If you do anything, anything at all, to damage what we have built here," he said slowly, "I will put you out on the street with nothing. No money, no identification, no paperwork of any kind. You do not exist without me. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Before I could answer, Carol's heels clicked against the concrete at the far end of the hallway, and she appeared in the yellow light, her champagne-colored dress catching the glow, her face arranged into something carefully expressionless. "You stay after the reception to clean up," she said, not raising her voice, not needing to, "and you do not speak to anyone from the Caldwell side. Not a single word." Then they turned and walked back toward the music, and the laughter, and the chandelier light, back toward the beautiful life they had spent 22 years constructing on top of mine. I stood alone in that hallway for a long moment after they were gone. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking, but when I searched myself for the fear that usually came with that shaking, I couldn't find it. What I found instead was something unfamiliar, something that had been buried so deep and for so long that I almost didn't recognize it when it finally surfaced. It was anger, raw and quiet and entirely my own, and once I felt it, I understood that nothing was ever going to be the same again. Later, when the reception was in full swing and the jazz band had drawn most of the guests onto the dance floor, I slipped out through the glass doors onto the hotel terrace. The Washington, D.C. skyline spread out before me in the darkness, the monuments lit soft and white against the night sky, the air cool and still against my face. I heard the door open behind me and knew before I turned around who it would be. Edward stepped out and came to stand beside me at the railing. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a photograph, old and soft at the edges, the surface worn smooth from years of being handled, unfolded, folded again. He held it out to me and I took it. In the pale light from the ballroom windows, I could make out a young woman in her mid-20s, dark chestnut hair falling loose around her shoulders, green eyes bright above a tired and radiant smile, cradling a newborn wrapped in a pink blanket. "This is my sister," Edward said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. Her name was Claire Ashford, and the baby she's holding, her name was Eleanor. I looked at the woman in the photograph for a long time, at the line of her jaw, at the shape of her nose, at her eyes, and something shifted in my chest, slow and seismic, like a fault line giving way after decades of pressure, because those eyes were identical to the ones I saw every single morning in the cracked mirror above the basement utility sink. "Let me take a DNA sample," Edward said, his voice breaking slightly at the edges now, the composure he had maintained all evening finally beginning to fracture. "If I am wrong, I give you my word. I will never contact you again. I will walk away and you will never hear from me. But if I am right..." He stopped, steadied himself, and looked at me directly. "Then the people inside that ballroom are not your family. They never were. They are the people who stole you." I said yes to Edward Caldwell that night on the terrace, and then I walked back through those glass doors, picked up my champagne tray, and spent the next 3 hours clearing tables and collecting empty glasses like nothing in the world had changed, even though I could feel, somewhere beneath my sternum, that everything had. 72 hours, that was how long the wait took. I went home. I woke at 5, the way I always did, the alarm pulling me out of a sleep that was lighter and more restless than usual. I cooked breakfast, scrubbed the kitchen floors, folded the laundry into neat stacks, and carried them upstairs. On the surface, everything looked exactly the same, but something had shifted underneath all of it. Quiet and permanent, the way a bone heals differently after it breaks. Every time Douglas came down the stairs and dropped into his leather chair and barked an order without looking up from his phone, I found myself watching him from the corner of my eye and turning a question over and over in my mind that I had never once allowed myself to form before. "Did you pay for me? How much did I cost?" On the second night, I reached under my mattress and pulled out that old folded newspaper and read the headline again by the thin light coming through the gap at the top of the basement door. "Baby girl abducted from Johns Hopkins Hospital, 2003, still missing." I had told myself it meant nothing. I had told myself that twice now. But Johns Hopkins was in Baltimore, 5 hours from Westport by car, and my hands would not stop trembling when I folded the paper back up and slid it out of sight. I lay in the dark for a long time after that, listening to the furnace hum and the pipes drip, and I thought about a young woman with green eyes holding a newborn in a pink blanket. I thought about what it would mean if that woman had been looking for me. I thought about what it would mean if she had never found me. On the third night, just before 11, the phone on the concrete floor beside my mattress buzzed once. I was awake instantly. "Results are in. Meet me tomorrow, 10 a.m., Café Trist, Adams Morgan, EC. I read it 3 times in the blue glow of the screen. Then I typed back 2 words. "I'll be there." Set the phone down, and lay back with my arms at my sides and my eyes open in the dark. The furnace hummed. The pipe dripped, and for the first time in 22 years, none of it frightened me. The next morning I waited until Carol had settled into the living room with her coffee and her magazine before I appeared in the doorway and told her I needed to pick up cleaning supplies. She turned a page without looking up. "Be back before noon," she said. "I've got guests coming at 1. I said yes, Mrs. Harmon, and I walked out the front door into the pale morning light, and I kept walking, and I did not look back once. Café Trist was a small corner place in Adams Morgan, exposed red brick walls, mismatched wooden chairs, warm amber light that fell in soft pools across the tables, the smell of fresh espresso so thick and rich it hit you the moment you pushed through the door. Edward was already there when I arrived, sitting in the far corner with a manila envelope on the table in front of him, and both hands wrapped around a coffee cup he hadn't touched. His eyes were red at the rims, the particular redness that comes not from crying, but from not sleeping, from lying awake doing the math on something you are almost certain of but terrified to confirm. He stood when he saw me. I sat down across from him. He didn't say anything. He just slid the envelope across the table and waited. My hands were trembling as I worked the clasp open and drew out the document inside. The language was exactly what you would expect from a laboratory report. Clinical, precise, dense with probability indices and reference numbers, and technical qualifiers. but one section near the bottom had been highlighted in yellow, and those were the only words that mattered. Combined index, 99.98%. Conclusion. The individual tested is the biological daughter of Claire Margaret Ashford, deceased. I read it once, then again, then a third time, slower, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less absolute if I gave them enough time. They didn't. I set the paper down carefully on the table and turned to look out the window. Outside on the street, Adams Morgan was going about its morning with complete indifference to what was happening in this corner booth. A woman walking a golden retriever, a man in a delivery uniform balancing a cardboard tray of coffees, two teenagers laughing at something on a phone screen. The most ordinary Tuesday morning in the world. And I was sitting here learning my own name for the first time at 22 years old. I didn't cry. I don't know why. Maybe there was something beyond crying at that point. Someplace grief and relief and anger and wonder all collapsed into each other and canceled out, leaving only a strange, ringing stillness. I looked at Edward, and I asked him the only question I actually needed answered. Did my mother know I was still alive? He set down his coffee cup. His jaw worked for a moment before the words came. Claire passed away in 2008, he said. Her heart gave out. The doctors attributed it to the cardiac condition she'd had since childhood, but the people who knew her friends, her doctors, the investigators she hired and refused to let stop, they all said the same thing. She never stopped looking for you. Not for a single day in 5 years. And eventually her body just couldn't carry the weight of it anymore. The silence between us stretched out long and quiet. But before she died, Edward continued, steadying his voice, she did something. She established a trust fund. She set it up in your name, in Eleanor Rose Ashford's name, to be held and released in the event that you were ever found. She never stopped believing that you would be. 1 week after that morning at Café Trist, Edward extended an invitation to the Harmon family. He was exploring a potential business partnership, he told them, and wanted to discuss some opportunities for Cole in person at his private estate in McLean, Virginia. Douglas called Carol into the kitchen the moment he got off the phone, and I heard him from the hallway, his voice bright with a kind of hunger I recognized. This is it, he said. Caldwell wants us in his inner circle. I knew this connection was going to pay off. Carol wore a new St. John's suit and her good pearl earrings. She touched them twice in the hallway mirror before they left. On the drive down to McLean, Cole leaned across the back seat toward me and dropped his voice to something just above a whisper. Don't say anything weird in front of these people. You hear me? This is my shot. I looked at him, really looked at him, maybe for the first time. The man who had stood at his own wedding and introduced me to his friends as the housekeeper. The man who had lived in the same house as me for 22 years and never once asked why I slept in the basement. And I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not anger, not pain. Just a vast and hollow emptiness where all of that used to be, as though the feeling had simply used itself up and gone quiet. The Caldwell estate in McLean sat behind tall stone gates at the end of a long gravel drive, the stones pale against the dark tree line, the crunch of gravel under the tires the only sound as we pulled up to the entrance. Inside, the sitting room was everything the Harmon house had always wanted to be. Oil paintings in gilded frames on every wall. Leather sofas the color of dark honey, ceilings that climbed nearly 20 feet overhead, afternoon light falling in long columns across an antique rug. Douglas took it all in with the quiet, covetous attention of a man calculating. Carol accepted a cup of tea with both hands and crossed her ankles the way she did when she wanted to appear refined. Nobody noticed the man in the charcoal gray suit, who was seated just inside the doorway of the adjacent room, a leather folder resting closed on his knee. Nobody noticed the woman standing beside him, or the badge clipped to her belt. From across the room, Edward caught my eye. The nod he gave me was so small it was almost nothing, a barely perceptible tilt of the chin, meant for no one else in that room but me. The FBI agents were already in position. Douglas Harmon had driven himself, in his own car, down his own chosen route, straight into the reckoning he had spent 22 years outrunning. And I, the girl with no name, no papers, no birth certificate, no legal proof that she had ever existed at all, was finally, for the first time in her life, not standing alone. People always say justice will come eventually. What they never tell you is that when it finally arrives, you don't feel like you've won anything. You just feel exhausted and relieved in a way so deep it makes your knees want to give out. Special Agent Torres stepped into the sitting room of the McLean estate, and his voice was flat and unhurried, the way people sound when they have done something many times before. Douglas Harmon, Carol Harmon, you are under arrest for human trafficking, document fraud, and child endangerment. Douglas moved first, 3 steps toward the far door, before 2 agents had him against the wall, his cheek pressed to the plaster, his wrists locked behind him. The man who had terrorized me for 22 years, who had starved me and beaten me and told me I did not exist without him, made a sound I had never heard from him before. Small, frightened, entirely human, Carol collapsed onto the leather sofa, mascara running in dark lines down her face, reaching toward me with both hands. "Ellie, please," she was saying. "Tell them this is a mistake. We raised you. We gave you everything." I looked at her for a long moment before I answered. "You gave me a basement," I said. "You gave me a cane kept behind the cereal boxes. You never once gave me my own name." Cole stood in the corner of the room the entire time without saying a single word, his face the color of chalk, looking like a man watching the floor disappear beneath his feet. The investigation moved quickly after that. Records showed that Douglas and Carol had purchased me through an underground adoption network in 2003 for $18,000 in untraceable cash. My name appeared in a ledger between a price and a delivery date, listed like inventory. Douglas received 19 years in federal prison. Carol received 13. The house in Westport was seized. Edward withdrew every form of financial support from Cole the same day of the arrest, and Cole lost his position at Caldwell Developments within the week. 3 weeks after that, Sophia filed for divorce. "I can't do this," she told him. "Your family bought a human being. I can't be associated with that." 7 months later, Cole called me, his voice stripped of every trace of the confidence I had grown up resenting. "I need your help," he said. "Just once." I let the silence sit for a moment before I answered. "In 22 years, did you ever help me?" He was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," he finally said. "I really don't know. That's exactly the problem," I told him, and I ended the call. I visited Douglas and Carol once at the Federal Correctional Facility in Cumberland, Maryland. I sat across from them at a metal table under fluorescent lights, and I said what I had been carrying inside me for more than 2 decades. "You told me I didn't exist without you," I said, looking directly at Douglas. "But I existed before I ever met you, and I will be here long after you are gone." He held my gaze for exactly 1 second before he looked away. That was enough. Edward walked me into the bank himself on the day the trust was released. We sat in a private room with oak paneling and soft lighting, while a banker explained the figures on the screen in front of us. $13,247,000, established by Claire Margaret Ashford in 2003, held in the name of Eleanor Rose Ashford, pending recovery. I sat there looking at that number, and I did not think about what I could buy or where I could go. I thought about my mother setting up that account while she was still searching, still believing, refusing to accept that her daughter was simply gone. "She never stopped," Edward told me quietly on the drive home. "Not for a single day." In the Caldwell family archives, Edward found a letter Claire had written the week I was taken, before she even knew I was missing. A letter meant to be tucked into a memory box for me to read someday. "My darling Eleanor, if you ever read these words, I want you to know that you were the greatest gift I was ever given. No matter where life takes you, you are loved, you are wanted, you are enough." I keep that letter on my nightstand at Georgetown, where I am studying clinical psychology with a focus on survivors of trafficking and family abuse. Some mornings I still wake before 5 out of habit, but now I make myself a cup of coffee and sit by the window and watch the light come in. And every morning when I look in the mirror, green eyes, dark chestnut hair, my mother's face looking back at me, I finally know exactly who I am. For 22 years I was told I was born to serve. I was told I had no name, no place, no seat at any table. Now I know the truth. I was not born to serve anyone. I was born to be loved. and I am spending the rest of my life making sure I never forget it, and making sure that others who are still in the dark know that the truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way into the light.